The sky was dark and full of snow when Jake's shuttle went down. He had been flying a solo delivery mission through Sector 7, a quiet part of the galaxy where few ships passed. A sudden storm hit. Lightning flashed, alarms screamed, and the engines failed one by one. He had no choice but to crash land on the nearest moon, a cold, rocky world covered in ice and jagged cliffs. When the shuttle finally stopped sliding down the side of a mountain, Jake sat in silence for a few seconds, heart pounding. Steam hissed from broken pipes. The windshield was cracked. A sharp pain in his shoulder reminded him he wasn't unharmed, but he was alive. Emergency beacon. Online, he said to himself as he checked the controls. The beacon was damaged, but blinking. Help would come, but it might take days. Jake wrapped himself in a thermal blanket, grabbed a small bag of supplies, and stepped outside. The air was cold and thin. Wind howled across the mountains. He needed shelter, fire, and something to eat. Hours passed as he searched the snowy terrain. Then he saw something strange. At the base of a tree, half covered in snow and branches, lay a figure. It wasn't human. It was small, with pale bluish-purple skin, long limbs, and dark hair scattered over its face. Jake hesitated. Was it alive? Was it dangerous? He moved closer. It was a girl, an alien girl, maybe around his age. She wasn't moving much, but her chest rose and fell. Her leg looked twisted and swollen. She must have crashed too. But how? Jake knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked softly. Her eyes opened slightly, violet and glowing faintly in the fading light. She blinked, looked at him, and then closed them again. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but she was injured and freezing. Leaving her, there wasn't an option. Jake picked her up carefully. She was light, fragile even. Every few steps, he checked to make sure she was still breathing. After nearly an hour of walking through snow, he found the entrance to an old weather station built by explorers long ago. It was mostly broken, but it had walls, a roof, and part of a heater still working. He laid the alien girl on a flat piece of foam padding and started a fire in a small metal barrel. The warmth spread slowly. She groaned as he removed a piece of broken armor from her leg. Her skin was scraped, and the swelling looked painful. He used a clean cloth from his kit to wrap it gently. "I don't know who you are," he said as he worked, "but I think you're going to be okay." She opened her eyes again and stared at him. This time she didn't look scared, just tired. Jake reached into his bag and opened a food pack. It wasn't much, just some protein cubes and water. He offered her a piece, and after a few moments, she reached out with shaky fingers and took it. They didn't speak the same language, but something passed between them, a moment of trust. When the wind outside grew stronger, Jake blocked the door with scrap metal. He set his emergency lamp beside them and sat down with a sigh. The warmth from the fire helped, but the girl still shivered slightly. Jake looked at her leg again. It was still swollen. His field training came back to him. Bruised muscles needed light pressure to improve circulation. It was basic first aid. "I'm going to help, okay?" he said slowly, making sure she could see he wasn't trying to hurt her. He reached forward and gently pressed along the side of her leg, careful not to touch the bone. She stiffened but didn't pull away. His hands moved slowly, carefully, just to ease the pain. But as he continued, she suddenly gasped. Jake looked up, startled. Her eyes were wide, watching him closely. She didn't speak, but her body tensed like she was surprised. Not afraid, just shocked. He pulled his hand back. I was just trying to help," he said softly. She didn't move for a moment. Then, very slowly, she placed her hand over his and left it there. Jake stared at their hands, unsure what he had just done or what it meant. Snow tapped against the walls. The fire crackled. In the silence, Two strangers from different worlds sat beside each other, connected by one small act of kindness, and something neither of them yet understood. The wind outside howled like a living thing. Snow hit the walls of the broken outpost again and again, making the structure creak. But inside, the fire burned softly, casting warm light on the faces of the two survivors. Jake sat close to the alien girl, watching her breathe steadily. Her skin still looked pale, but her shivering had slowed. She was resting now, one hand still resting on her bandaged leg, and the other curled near her chest. Jake stayed awake, not just to keep the fire going, but to protect them both. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what species she belonged to or why she was here. But something about her, her quiet strength, her soft breathing, made him feel calm, even though they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Jake pulled a small device from his pack and checked the emergency beacon again. Still blinking, still damage. A rescue signal was being sent, but it was weak. It might take days before anyone heard it. They were on their own. He took another look at the girl's leg. It was swollen, but not worse. That was a good sign. The massage seemed to help her, but he didn't want to risk doing too much. He wrapped a thermal blanket over her body, careful not to disturb her injury. Just then, she opened her eyes again. Their eyes met. "You're awake," Jake said softly. Of course, she didn't understand the words, but she blinked slowly, like she understood the feeling behind them. She tried to sit up, wincing in pain. Jake gently put a hand on her shoulder to stop her. "No, don't move too much. Your legs still hurt." The girl pointed to her chest and made a soft humming sound, then touched his shoulder lightly. Her touch was gentle, almost like a thank you. Jake gave her a small smile. "You're welcome." She looked around the shelter and then back at him. Her eyes narrowed in thought. Then she slowly pointed upward and made a motion with her hand, like something crashing down from the sky. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I crashed too. Bad storm." She tilted her head, trying to understand. Then, with effort, she pointed to herself, then to the sky, then made a gesture of something breaking apart. Jake understood. "You crashed too." She nodded. Jake was amazed. Two different species, stranded by the same storm, now stuck together in a freezing world. It felt like something out of a storybook. He stood up and stretched. His shoulders still hurt, but he could manage. The next problem was food. He only had enough rations for 2 more days, maybe 3 if he ate less. But she needed strength to heal. He decided to give her a full portion that night. She ate slowly, carefully, her eyes always watching him. She looked at every item, smelling, tasting, touching, like she had never seen human food before. "You don't have anything like this, huh?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, but after chewing, she nodded slowly. Jake laughed. "Glad you like it." When the wind died down for a while, Jake stepped outside to check the area. The snow had piled higher. He scanned the sky, but saw no ships, no lights, nothing but gray clouds and cold silence. He collected a few broken wooden panels from the back of the station and returned inside to block more of the wind. The girl had moved a little, trying to sit up against the wall. She looked tired but alert. She watched Jake work, then pointed to the panels and made a shape with her fingers, almost like she was trying to help him improve the wall. Jake blinked. "You want to help?" She gave a small nod. Over the next hour, they worked together. Jake moved the wood into place, and she pointed out cracks and small gaps. They used whatever supplies they had, old cloth, scrap metal, wires, to seal the space. When they were done, the fire felt warmer. The cold wind no longer reached them. Jake sat down beside her again. She reached out, slowly, and touched his chest, right over his heart. Then she made a small motion with her fingers, almost like drawing a symbol. "What's that?" he asked. She repeated it. Point, symbol, chest. Jake didn't know what it meant. A name. A gesture from her people. A word for thanks. Whatever it was, it felt important. He pointed to himself. Jake. She looked confused for a moment, then her eyes widened. She tapped her own chest. Lie. Ari. Jake smiled. Liari. That's your name. She nodded. They sat quietly for a while, listening to the fire crackle. Jake felt something shift in the air. Not danger, but something new. Something that made this strange alien girl feel a little less like a stranger. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But in that quiet, cold shelter, he had a name to call her now. And somehow, that made everything feel a little less lonely. The fire crackled softly, its orange glow dancing across the walls of the shelter. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling through the jagged mountains, but inside, it was warm and quiet. Jake sat on the ground beside Liari, the alien girl. She was still recovering, her pale blue skin now warmer to the touch, but her leg remained swollen. Despite the food and warmth, it was clear she wasn't fully healed yet. Jake glanced at the medical supplies he had left. They were running low. He had just enough to get them through a few more days. If the weather didn't clear soon, they might have to rely on each other even more. He turned to Liari. She was sitting upright now, her back leaning against the wall, her legs stretched out in front of her. Her eyes were focused on him, studying every movement, every gesture. There was something strange in her gaze, something that made him feel like he wasn't just helping a stranded traveler. It was as if he was part of something much bigger. You're still in pain, Jake said quietly, looking at her leg. She glanced down at her leg, then back up at him. She gave a small nod, though she didn't speak. Her language was foreign to him, and she had yet to say anything that Jake could fully understand. But her eyes, those violet eyes, spoke volumes. Jake remembered his field training. When you're stuck with limited supplies, you have to think creatively. He had seen many injured people in his time, and though he wasn't a doctor, he knew that pressure and light massage could sometimes help with swelling and muscle stiffness. His hands hesitated for only a moment before he gently reached for her leg. I'm going to try something, Jake said, his voice soft. Liari's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. She didn't say anything, but there was a quiet understanding between them. She trusted him, even without knowing the full reason why. Jake placed his hands gently on her swollen leg, starting just below the knee. His fingers pressed lightly, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his touch. He moved slowly, applying steady pressure to the muscles around her leg, hoping to ease the tension and improve the circulation. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it was the best he could do with what he had. At first, there was no reaction from Liari. She remained still, her eyes locked on his hands. Jake continued for a few minutes, the silence between them comfortable. But then something unexpected happened. Liari gasped sharply, her body stiffening. Jake froze, his hand still resting lightly on her leg. She didn't pull away, but her expression was one of surprise, maybe even shock. Her eyes widened, and her breathing quickened. Jake quickly pulled his hands back, concern flooding his chest. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, his voice full of worry. Liari slowly placed a hand on her chest, as if trying to calm herself. Then she looked at Jake, her eyes softening. She didn't speak, but she gave him a slow, hesitant nod, signaling that she was okay. But the look in her eyes remained intense. Something had changed. The silence between them stretched on, filled only with the crackle of the fire. Jake didn't understand what had happened. He had only done what seemed like the right thing, but her reaction was something he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Liari reached out slowly and touched his hand. Her fingers were light, almost tentative. She guided his hand back to her leg, showing him where to touch. He hesitated but then gently resumed the massage, being even more careful than before. This time, her response was different. She didn't stiffen. Instead, she closed her eyes, a soft exhale escaping her lips. Jake felt a strange sense of accomplishment, but it was mixed with confusion. Why had her reaction been so strong? He had helped people before, and this kind of response was new to him. Maybe it was part of her culture. Maybe physical contact was more significant to her than it was to him. As he worked, Leary's body seemed to relax, her breathing slowing. Her leg, though still swollen, appeared less tense. After a while, she opened her eyes and looked at him again. "Is it better?" Jake asked softly, his voice full of uncertainty. Leary gave him a slow nod, and this time there was a small smile on her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jake to see that she was feeling better. She gave a quiet sigh, as if the pain had lessened, even if only slightly. Jake let his hands fall to his sides, unsure of what to do next. He didn't want to overstep, but something in his chest told him that this simple act of care had bridged a gap between them. Leary stared at him for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful, almost like she was seeing him in a new light. She reached out again, this time touching his face lightly, just below his cheek. The touch was soft, delicate, as if she was learning what it felt like to trust him. "Thank you," she said in her language, though the words were foreign to Jake. Yet, somehow, he understood the meaning. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. It was a gesture of gratitude, of something deeper than words could express. Jake smiled and nodded. "You're welcome." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a quiet understanding, a connection born from a shared moment of kindness. As the fire flickered, Jake realized that, in a strange way, they had begun to build something between them. Trust, respect, maybe even friendship. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, in their little shelter, things felt a little warmer. The hours passed in a quiet rhythm, with only the sounds of the fire and the howling wind outside breaking the silence. Jake sat across from Leary, watching her slowly recover. Her leg was still swollen, but it seemed less painful, the tension starting to ease. She rested her head against the wall, her eyes closed, but every now and then she would glance at him with those intense violet eyes. The air in the shelter had warmed, but it was still cold enough outside that they would need to stay put until the storm passed. Jake kept the fire fed, his eyes occasionally flicking to the alien girl. There was something about her presence that felt oddly familiar, like they had known each other for much longer than they actually had. He could tell she wasn't just another survivor of the storm. There was something about her, something different. Leary stirred and slowly sat up, still holding her leg with one hand. She made a small noise, looking up at Jake, then pointed to the supplies he had used for the fire. She looked at him, then back to the fire, her expression focused. "Yeah, it's a lot of work to keep it going," Jake replied with a small smile, although he wasn't sure she understood. "But it's better than freezing." She nodded thoughtfully, then glanced toward the door, as if waiting for something. Jake followed her gaze but saw nothing but snow. No ships, no signs of rescue. The storm had swallowed up everything beyond the shelter's walls. They were alone. Leary made a soft sound and then mimicked a motion with her hands, like she was trying to lift something heavy. Jake looked at her, trying to understand. She repeated the movement again, her eyes locked on his. "You want to help?" Jake asked slowly, trying to piece together what she was trying to say. Leary smiled faintly and nodded, though her expression was still a little serious. She gestured toward his pack, and then to herself. "You want something from the pack?" Jake asked, picking up the bag and opening it to show her the contents. There was food, medical supplies, and a few personal items, but not much else. Leary shook her head, pointing again to herself. She made the lifting motion again, and then placed her hand over her heart, pausing like she was waiting for him to understand. Jake frowned for a moment, his mind racing. She wasn't asking for food or supplies. She wasn't asking for a drink either. Then it clicked. "You want to help with the shelter," Jake said slowly. But you are still hurt. You can't help much with your leg." Liari looked at him and shook her head again, her violet eyes growing more determined. She placed both hands on the ground, then made a motion like she was pushing something. "Okay," Jake said, nodding. He was still a little unsure of what she meant, but it seemed like she wanted to do something more, something to feel useful, something to keep her mind occupied. He stood up and walked over to a pile of scrap metal and wood that they had collected earlier. He began sorting through it, moving it around, and then glanced at Liari. "If you want to help, you can start by helping me move some of this." Liari's eyes lit up. She seemed to understand immediately. She slowly stood up, wincing slightly at the pain in her leg, but still managing to make her way over to the pile of debris. Her movements were careful, but she was determined. Jake stepped aside and watched as she sorted through the pile, lifting a small piece of metal and carefully placing it on a nearby stack. She looked up at him for approval, her eyes searching his face. "Good job," Jake said with a smile. It felt strange to be so proud of someone who wasn't human, but in that moment, it felt like she was just as capable as anyone else. They worked together in silence for a while, Jake picking up pieces of broken wood and handing them to Liari, who used her strength to move them to a more stable area. The wind outside grew louder, but inside, the shelter felt safer. Liari seemed content, focusing on the task at hand. With each movement, her confidence grew. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a companion, a teammate in this strange, cold world. After some time, they had managed to make the shelter more secure. The walls were reinforced with more metal, and the heat from the fire now seemed to fill the room more evenly. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. Liari stopped for a moment, wiping her hands on her clothes. She looked at Jake and then back to the fire. Her expression softened, and she placed a hand over her chest once more. Jake tilted his head. "What does that mean?" She pointed to herself, then repeated the motion. "I don't get it," Jake admitted, though he could tell it was important. She seemed to be saying something personal, something significant. She smiled faintly and then motioned to Jake's chest, repeating the gesture again. Her smile lingered a little longer this time, as if she were trying to convey something that words couldn't. Jake blinked, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He had never been the type to form bonds quickly, but there was something about Liari that made him feel connected to her in a way that he couldn't explain. "Maybe," he said slowly, "maybe we're both just trying to survive. And maybe we'll make it out of here together." Liari nodded, her smile growing a little more, her eyes shining with an emotion that Jake couldn't quite understand, but he could feel it. The bond between them wasn't just survival anymore. It was something deeper, something that felt like a quiet promise, a wordless understanding that, no matter how strange or difficult the world around them was, they would face it together. The next morning, Jake woke to the soft glow of the fire and the quiet rhythm of snow tapping against the shelter's walls. Liari was still asleep, her body curled up under a thick blanket of thermal cloth. She had looked more relaxed than she had in days, and her leg was no longer swollen to the extent it had been. Though still injured, she seemed to be getting better. Jake rubbed his eyes and stretched. His own body ached from the cold and the long hours spent in this isolated shelter, but he was used to discomfort. It was survival, plain and simple. He stood up and went to check the emergency beacon again. Still no sign of rescue. He had almost given up hope of a quick recovery. The storm had caused major damage to his ship, and the remote location meant that the signal wasn't going to reach anyone for a while. He turned back to Liari, who was now awake. She was sitting up, her back against the wall. She seemed to be staring at the fire, lost in thought. Her gaze flickered to Jake as he moved about, preparing the small meal he had left. "Morning," Jake said, trying to sound cheerful. Liari blinked, then offered a small smile. Her eyes were bright and alert, but still distant. She had been through something difficult, and Jake could tell she was still processing everything. He handed her a ration pack, offering a piece of the dried food. She took it without hesitation, and they both ate in silence for a while. The shelter was cozy now, safe enough to give them some peace, but Jake knew this wouldn't last forever. The storm couldn't last this long, and the more time they spent here, the more likely it was that they would draw attention. A few hours later, just as Jake was finishing up the final repairs to the shelter, a deep hum filled the air. It was a sound Jake recognized from his past work, though it wasn't one he expected to hear out here in the middle of nowhere. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound grew louder, vibrating the walls of the shelter. His first thought was that it was the storm, but the tone was wrong. Too steady, too mechanical. Lieri's eyes widened as the sound reached her ears. She stood up slowly, the slight limp in her step still noticeable, but not as severe as before. She reached out to Jake, a nervous look crossing her face. "Stay close," Jake said quietly, glancing toward the door. "Something's coming." Within moments, the ground shook, and the hum turned into a full mechanical roar. The shelter's metal walls groaned in response. Jake quickly grabbed his emergency rifle, which he had stashed near the door. He wasn't sure what was coming, but he needed to be prepared. Lieri stepped forward, her expression serious. She raised a hand, as if trying to silence him, and slowly moved toward the door. She looked out through a small crack in the wall. Jake watched her, confused. What was she doing? She was still injured. What could she possibly be thinking? Before he could ask, the hum grew louder, and suddenly the door burst open with a loud crash. Jake's rifle came up instinctively, but before he could fire, Lieri stepped in front of him, raising her hand to stop him. 3 large figures stepped into the shelter, their heavy boots making the floor tremble. Jake lowered his rifle in shock. These weren't just any aliens. They were warriors, clad in dark, shining armor. They looked like a heavily armed military force, their faces hidden behind helmets and their postures commanding. Lieri stepped forward and bowed her head, lowering herself to one knee in front of them. Jake froze. What was happening? Who were they? One of the armored figures stepped forward, his voice deep and metallic as it echoed in the shelter. "Lieri," he said, his tone firm. "You have been found." Jake looked back and forth between the newcomers and Lieri, his confusion growing. Lieri did not respond with words, but the warriors did not seem to mind. The one who spoke nodded and turned to the others, giving a sharp command in a language Jake didn't understand. The other 2 soldiers stood by, watching him carefully. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but uncertain. One of the soldiers turned toward him. "We are her protectors," the soldier said, his voice sounding less like a threat and more like a statement of fact. "And you are the human who saved her." Jake blinked, still trying to process the situation. "Saved her," he echoed. "I don't understand." The soldier seemed to read his confusion. "You have helped Lieri. We owe you a debt for her safety." Lieri raised her head, looking up at the armored soldiers. Her eyes were serious, but there was something else, something Jake couldn't quite read. She was no longer the fragile, wounded girl he had found in the snow. She was a figure of strength now, commanding respect from the soldiers before her. She spoke in a soft, melodic tone, her voice carrying weight. Jake couldn't understand the language, but the way she spoke made him feel like she was commanding the room. The soldiers listened, nodding in understanding, and then one of them spoke again. "Her people will come for her," the soldier said to Jake. "We were sent to bring her home. But first, we thank you. We will see that you are taken care of." Jake didn't know what to say. He didn't know who these people were, or what kind of debt Lieri had with them. But one thing was clear. She wasn't just any alien girl. She was someone important. "I didn't do it for thanks," Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. "I just helped because she needed it." Lieri turned to him, her eyes softening for a moment. She placed her hand over her heart and gave him a small nod of gratitude. Then, without another word, the soldiers turned and began to leave. As they passed by, the leader of the group gave Jake one final look. "We will return for her. You may go or stay, as you wish. But know that you are not forgotten." With that, they exited the shelter, leaving Jake and Leary alone once more. Jake looked at her, still processing everything that had just happened. She had known them, and they had known her. But what did it all mean for him? The warriors left, and the shelter became quiet once more. The only sound now was the crackling of the fire, which had grown dim in the absence of the storm outside. Jake looked around, his mind still processing what had just happened. Leary had known those soldiers. She wasn't just a random alien. She was someone important, someone with a past, a connection to these fierce-looking warriors. Leary stood still for a moment, her head lowered. Her violet eyes flickered over to Jake, but she didn't say anything. There was a quiet tension in the air, one that Jake couldn't quite place. "What just happened?" Jake asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Who were they? And why didn't you tell me who you were?" Leary turned toward him, her face calm, but there was something in her eyes. A hesitation, a weight she was carrying. She moved slowly toward the fire and knelt down beside it, her hands resting on her legs. Jake sat down next to her, watching her carefully. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. She seemed to be struggling with something, trying to form the right words in a language that was clearly not her own. Jake waited patiently, unsure of how to help. He didn't know what she was going through. To him, she was just a person, a survivor, like him. But from the way the soldiers had treated her, he could see that she was more than that. She was part of something bigger. Leary had grown stronger. Her leg wasn't perfect, but she could move around more easily now. Jake had learned to trust her instincts, as she quickly adapted to their new life together. There was a sense of teamwork between them, though neither of them had said it outright. They both knew they were in this together, for better or worse. But even in their small, isolated world, something was shifting between them. Leary had opened up to Jake more than she ever had before. She told him more about her past, the royal family she came from, the expectations placed on her, and the life she had escaped. It wasn't easy for her to talk about, but Jake could tell that she needed to say it, to make sense of everything she had left behind. One evening, as the wind howled louder than ever outside, Jake found himself staring at Leary as she worked by the fire, her eyes lost in thought. There was something about her, something powerful and yet vulnerable at the same time. He had helped her when she was hurt, but in many ways, she had helped him more than he could explain. It was in the way she didn't ask for anything. It was in the way she tried to find a purpose, even when it seemed like the world was against her. Jake respected that. He admired it. Leary caught his gaze and smiled faintly. Her smile wasn't the kind that showed in an obvious way. It was subtle, soft, but it meant something more than any words could express. She walked over to him, standing close but not touching. She reached out slowly and placed a hand on his shoulder. Jake looked at her, his heart racing. They hadn't spoken much about what had happened between them, the small touches, the quiet moments, the growing bond. They had never needed to. It was there, unspoken, but understood. "You're still here," Leary said softly, her voice carrying a mix of gratitude and something deeper. "Why?" Jake blinked, surprised by the question. "Because I'm not going to leave you alone. I know what it's like to be stranded, to feel like you're on your own. And I'm not going to just walk away." Leary nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I know, but I wonder sometimes, what will happen to you when this is all over? What if they take me away? What if I have to go back to my world?" Jake's throat tightened. He had thought about that. He knew she couldn't stay here forever, and he didn't want to be the one to keep her from returning to her people if it meant something to her. But at the same time, the thought of losing her made something inside him stir. "I don't know what will happen," Jake said, his voice steady. but I know that I'm not going to let you go without a choice. You deserve to make your own decisions, to be free. If that means fighting for it, then we'll fight." Laeri looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something more, something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered. She sat down beside him, her presence both calming and powerful. It was in the way she carried herself, the quiet strength she had, even when she didn't speak. They sat there for a long time, the fire crackling between them, the world outside still as wild as ever. Later that night, after another quiet meal, Laeri stood up, moving toward the door of the shelter. Jake followed her, his curiosity piqued. She paused for a moment, looking out at the storm, her eyes focused on something far beyond. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, his voice soft but genuine. Laeri didn't turn to him right away. She stood still, watching the snow swirl outside, the world beyond their little shelter a mystery they couldn't control. She took a deep breath, then slowly turned to face him. "I'm thinking that maybe it's time," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "Time to make a choice." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer, unsure what she meant. But he could see it in her eyes. She was ready to act, ready to face whatever was coming. "What kind of choice?" Jake asked, his voice thick with emotion. Laeri looked at him with a soft but resolute smile. "The choice to be free. The choice to stand for what I believe in. Whether it means going back to my people or staying here with you, I have to make it." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a blanket. He could feel it, the growing tension between them, the unspoken connection, the pull of something neither of them could ignore. He had always fought for his own freedom, but he hadn't expected to find someone else who wanted the same thing. "Then let's do it," Jake said, his voice quiet but strong. "We'll do it together." Laeri stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm in a way that was both gentle and assertive. The touch lingered, a quiet promise of what was to come. Together, they would face whatever came next, whether it meant fighting against her past or making a future in this strange new world. They would make it their choice.